Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Just a quick heads up, this video is a 30-minute snippet from one of my courses called Zap into Automation. If you're interested in getting started with workflow automation, this module covers all the critical concepts that you need to know. Once you have a full grasp on all of these topics, you can pick up any automation tool and you will feel at home. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video. All right, welcome to Module 1, Basic Concepts. So let's begin by taking a look at the learning objectives for this particular module. So first and foremost, we will define what is a workflow. We'll define what is automation. As a whole, they form workflow automation, which is what this whole course is about. Then I'll also show you different types of automations, although we are only going to be focusing on a single type of automation, but it makes sense to have context into when we say automation out in the wild, it could mean different things. And it's always a good idea to be aware of the different types of automation that exists out there. The next one is benefits of automation. We'll talk about what are some of the benefits that you get by automating workflows and why should you even care. And then finally, we will get behind the scenes. So this is where the bulk of the talking is going to happen. This is where we will cover the 4 ingredients that make automation possible and how they're implemented in various automation tools. So once you understand these concepts, then it doesn't matter which automation tool you pick up. The concepts are going to be exactly the same. There will be triggers, there will be actions, and so on and so forth. So that's why it's important to understand how it all works behind the scenes, so that if you choose to move to a different tool down the road, you should still have the understanding of the basics and not stumble when you move on to something else other than Zapier. So that's the idea behind it. In this module, we focus on the fundamentals, and then the implementation automatically becomes relatively simpler because you will have all the fundamental knowledge needed to automate your workflows. So let's get into it. Okay. What is a workflow? Let's start by looking at the formal definition of a workflow. So it's defined as a sequence of tasks that processes a set of data. So what's happening here is we're talking about there's some steps that we go through where the data goes from step 1 to step 2 and so on and so forth. And there's some kind of processing happening at each step. And together, the sequence of all the tasks or the steps where we process the data forms a workflow. A sequence of tasks that processes a set of data. It is best explained if we look at a few examples. So example number 1, and this is a personal example because it has happened to me many times. But what's happening here is that, let's say an after hours event is created in your calendar, right? And this is in your work calendar. So you realize that, okay, you have to attend this event because it's after hours, it's a team dinner or whatever you may have. What you do is you open your personal calendar, or at least I used to open my personal calendar and then add the same event in my personal calendar, just because we maintained a family calendar where we added all our events. So everyone knows when someone is available or not. So you open the personal calendar in step 2, and then step 3, you add the same event in your personal calendar, right? And then finally, I would notify my family that, hey, this is coming up. I will be gone. So 4 steps happening here in this example. An event is created, then you decide to open a different calendar, and then you add the same event in that calendar, and then finally you notify someone, whoever needs to know about that particular event. So 4 steps, or you can say 4 tasks rather, because each step is a task. So those are tasks that you're performing in a sequence. And also notice that there's some data being transferred from each task to the next one. So first one, you open the calendar, you read the details of the event, then you open your personal calendar. The fact that you had to open the personal calendar is processing some data. You had to decide in your mind which app to open. The third one, you had to create the same event, but that event requires some data. That data comes from step 1 because you need to add the same details: when the event is, what the event is of type, how long the event is, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you had to notify the family. And in that step, again, there's some data being processed, which you take from the previous step. So in this case, how long you'll be gone for, when you'll be gone for, and who you are notifying. So this is all data. So you're performing tasks and processing data at each step. The other one, let's say in this case, you receive an email and the email contains a task for you. Someone emails you that, hey, this is what you need to do. It could be your manager, it could be your team, it could be your client, whoever. You receive an email with a task. So typically you would, obviously everyone has different systems, but in this example, the person is opening their to-do list application, and then they're going to create the task in their to-do list application based on what they received in the email. And then finally, once the task has been created, they categorize the task. Maybe they prioritize it, maybe they add some labels, maybe they add some tags, and so on and so forth. So again, 4 tasks are happening: email read, to-do list app opened, a new task created, and the tasks categorized. So 4 tasks, and then each step we process some data. And in this case, the data that's being processed is all about the tasks, which is going from step 1 to step 4. So again, it's a sequence of tasks that process a set of data, and this thing as a whole can be called a workflow. So you can call this your email to to-do list app workflow, for example. Or the first one could have been called your work calendar to personal calendar workflow. So these workflows can be named, but essentially at the end of the day, it's a sequence of tasks, right? So that is a workflow in a nutshell. Now, if you take a step back and see, or observe rather, what is common in these two scenarios? We talked about 2 scenarios so far. So what's common between these 2 scenarios? So if you look carefully, there are 4 things common in both the scenarios. Scenarios are manual. There's some tasks that are being performed manually. They both take time. Now, of course, how time consuming they are depends on the workflow, but it starts to add up. They're both rules-based, right? So there were some rules that were being applied, like which calendar to open or how to categorize a task, because in your brain, you have some rules that this is a high priority task, or maybe you read it from the email and decided that this is a high priority task. So there's some rules being applied. And then finally, they're very well defined. Every time I follow the same sequence. I open my to-do list, I add a task, and I categorize a task. Or I open my calendar, I add an event, and I notify my family. So they're pretty well defined, and they can be replicated easily. So when you have these 4 things common in any workflow, or when these 4 things are present in any workflow, that basically means that they can be automated. So a workflow itself is not automated. A workflow could be a manual workflow, which is what we have been talking about. But when you have these 4 signs available, meaning if a sequence is manual, it is time consuming, it is rules based and defined, that means it is a good candidate to be automated. So next, let's define what is automation. So now that we understand what is a workflow, let's formally define what is automation. We always throw this term around that, hey, let's automate that, let's automate this, but what does it really mean? What does it really stand for? So if you look at the formal definition, automation describes a wide range of technologies that reduce human intervention in the processes. Tech that reduces human intervention in the processes. And it's not saying eliminating human intervention or eliminating the human aspect altogether. It is talking about reducing human intervention. Because no matter what, we will always need some kind of human intervention, especially when the processes are complicated, the workflows are complicated. So the idea here is that at least reduce human intervention so that we can move faster and only perform human effort on the tasks that absolutely cannot be automated. So it's a wide range of tech. It's way beyond just automating, your to-do list and your email. It's a whole array of automation that exists out there. So all in all, when we combine the 2, workflows and automation, we get workflow automation. We identify workflows, the complicated ones, and we figure out some tech, and we figure out a way to use that tech to automate these workflows, and we get workflow automation. All right, let's talk about types of automation. And generally speaking, there are 3 types of automation that exist. So let's go one at a time. The first one is industrial automation. So this is basically, we're talking about automation in the factories. So the first image here shows, and this is pretty common in Amazon warehouses or other warehouses that are shipping, large amounts of packages on a daily basis. There are all these robots moving around, these Roomba-like bots that either are bringing the shelves to the people who are packaging your products or actually picking up the products themselves. So there's various kinds. It's pretty sophisticated, but it's not all automated. A lot of the human intervention has been eliminated because these bots can perform those same tasks. Then we have lots of bots, or these are actually called robotic arms, that are used in car manufacturing facilities. So again, to produce the cars at such a fast pace, if everything would have been done by hand, it would be really expensive to produce the cars. There was some tech that was figured out and some workflows that these robotic arms can perform, and it was then delegated over to them. And then the third example here, again, an industrial automation example, like a bottling facility. So all these mineral water bottles or cans of soda and so on and so forth. All these, again, if you think about packaging them manually, it would be a lot of effort. So there's some tech that is used behind the scenes in the factories that automates some of these things that don't require human intervention. So those are some of the examples of industrial automation. Talking about automation on the personal front, again, there's a lot of that you might already be using or might be aware of. So for example, smart home or the whole smart home setup is a personal automation. So maybe switching the lights off at a certain time of the day, or watering your plants at a certain time of the day, or turning the air conditioner off when the temperature reaches a certain temperature. These are all types of personal automations in the smart home spectrum. But then there's also things like on an iPhone, for example, you can use the automation app to say turn on the do not disturb mode when you open a particular app. For example, in this case, Kindle. And this is a screenshot from my phone. And then the do not disturb is automatically turned off when the Kindle app is closed. So those are some of the examples of personal automation. And then the last one is business automation. So we're talking about, so it's the same thing, but now the context is different. So now we're talking about automation is in the business context, right? So for example, here is a bot, or a Slack bot rather, that automatically responds to a question. So I've seen this in big companies where some questions are so common, and most of the times someone who knows the answer respond or link that person to a particular page in the internal wiki about that particular question. So in this case, I used to work at Expedia, and there was a common question like, hey, how can I get reimbursed for my travel expenses? And then every time someone had to respond that, hey, check the policy on the internal wiki, or hey, here's a link and this is how you do it. But even it could have been a bot where it's listening to the questions, and when it has an answer, especially this is now much easier with AI, it can respond automatically to that particular employee with a link to the travel policy, or rather with the travel policy itself. So again, if this is automated, then a lot of cycles are saved, and every time some person doesn't have to step away from what they're doing and respond to this person's question. And a lot of time this falls on the shoulders of the managers, but these automations can reduce that human intervention. And now we are really getting into the details. So this is business automation in the context of, say, an e-commerce business. So let's say the order is placed on the website, the customer has given the credit card information, the payment goes through, the order is successfully placed. So the next step in the workflow would be to notify the warehouse or whoever is going to be shipping that product that, hey, this order was just received, start preparing the order. At the same time, you're responsible for generating an invoice, and you're supposed to send that invoice to the customer that, hey, their payment was successful, here's the invoice. And again, in sophisticated systems, these things are already built in. But think about a small business who is trying to keep the costs pretty low, and maybe are still doing things manually, and like maybe literally calling the warehouse and telling them to place the order, or maybe generating the invoice by hand. So in those contexts, these are the things that can be automated, automatically generating the invoice, automatically notifying the warehouse. And then further, you can continue automating a lot of the steps, maybe not all of the steps, but a lot of them. So for example, you can automatically generate a shipping label. And then once the shipping label is generated, you notify the customer that, hey, this is the tracking number. This is when you expect the order. You should expect the order to receive, to be delivered. And then so on and so forth. There's so many steps after the fact. Maybe there's returns involved, or maybe you're asking the customer to leave a feedback. So all these things, if they're happening manually, and they're time consuming, of course, and if they're well defined and they're rules based, we can automate them. And in this context, this is called business automation. So again, automation is technologies that reduce human intervention in the processes. There's 3 types of automation: industrial, personal, and business. Our focus for this particular course is going to be business automation. Now that we know what is workflow automation and that our focus is going to be on business automation, let's go behind the scenes. And the reason I want to do that is to show you how automation actually works. We know what it is. We know why we want to do it, but how does it work? What makes automation, especially business automation, even possible? So there are 4 things that make this possible. So let's go through them one at a time. So the 4 things are workflow triggers, actions, communication between the applications, and a system to define the rules, or you can call it a rule book. So let's start from the top by defining what are workflow triggers. And just to recap, these are the 4 things that are necessary or that make business automation possible. And so it only makes sense to understand what they are because all the automation tools rely on these 4 things. So let's start from the top. Hey, sorry to interrupt, but just wanted to remind you, if you are finding this valuable, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to continue learning more about automation, you can find the link to the full course in the description below. Now back to the video. And the first one is workflow triggers. So workflow triggers are nothing but events that cause a workflow to run. So something has to happen for the workflow to start. It's not going to start on its own. There's some event that causes the workflow or notifies the workflow that, hey, it's time to go. So in our examples, if you go all the way back, the first example was an after hours event was created. So the fact that I received a notification in my work calendar that an event has been created acted as a trigger for me to continue down that sequence of tasks. Or in the next one, where I received an email with a task attached for me, the fact that I received and opened the email acted as a trigger. So triggers are events. So those are the two events that took place for me to continue down the sequence of tasks or for me to go through the workflow. So those events that cause a workflow to run are known as workflow triggers or simply triggers. The triggers can be of three types. First one is a scheduled trigger. Second one is an on-demand trigger. And the third one is called app events trigger. So the scheduled trigger, as the name suggests, is based on time. So every day at 3 p.m. or every week on Monday at 10 a.m. or once a month, and so on and so forth. You can decide the frequency and you can schedule that, hey, every time this happens, like it's 3 p.m. on a Friday or 10 a.m. on a Monday, or it's the first of the month, run this workflow. So the trigger can be as simple as the time of the day, week, month, or whatever. Or it can be, the second one is the on-demand triggers. So the on-demand triggers, as the name suggests, they're on demand. You can run the workflow whenever you want to. You decide. So how will you let the workflow know that you want to run it? It can be as simple as a click of a button. There are other means as well, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just go with a click of a button. So maybe there's an app on your phone, you click a button, and that triggers a workflow. So this is on demand. And the last one, which is what makes automation exciting in the business world, is application events. So these are events that are taking place within different apps that we use that automatically act as the trigger for certain workflows to run. So let's take a look at the app events in more detail. So app events, again, they can be anytime you're doing anything in any application, it can act as a trigger. But that application has to support it because that information has to be passed on to the workflow. So the app must support it. And then we'll take a look at what events and what triggers are supported by each application when we get to Zapier. But for now, I'll give you some common examples. So it could be as simple as an event is created in the calendar, or an order has been placed, or someone submitted a survey, or a task was assigned to a particular person, an email was labeled, or many others. So all these are things that happen within an application, which we can listen on and use as triggers to run our workflows. So just to recap, three types: scheduled, on-demand, and app events. And app events, of course, there's a million types of events that we can use as triggers in our workflows. All right, so now that we understand what are workflow triggers, let's talk about the second thing that we need for automation to take place. And honestly, triggers and actions are the biggest components that make this possible. Without actions, there is no automation. So as always, let's start with the formal definition. An action is an event that the system performs after a workflow has been triggered. So this is a response. This is the computer's response to the trigger. Some kind of task that the computer or the system performs after a workflow has been triggered. That is called an action. So to put it into perspective, let's take a look at a few examples of types of actions that exist out there. So it could be as simple as sending a text. So because sending a text is a task that a computer can perform, and it could be based on any kind of trigger. It doesn't matter what trigger it is. We're talking about actions here. So these are the things that the system will perform on your behalf. So instead of you sending the text manually, the system will send it on your behalf. Or it could be updating a CRM. It could be adding something to a Google Sheet or an Excel file. It could be creating a new task, notifying somebody, and many others. So these are all the types of, these are different types of actions that can take place and can be automated, and the system will perform on your behalf. All right, so those are triggers and actions. Next up is communication between the apps. All right. Now that we understand workflow triggers, actions, it's time to talk about communication. And this is communication between the applications. And it's not someone calling their friend. This is app to app communication. Because remember, the trigger could be in a different application than the application where you want the action to take place. For example, the trigger could be the email, your email application, but the action, the corresponding action might be in your to-do list application or in some other application. So they're not necessarily happening in the same application. And therefore, there has to be some communication between the two, communication between the apps. So that is going to be the focus of this particular lesson. And the best way to describe this communication between the applications is to take an example. And the example in this case is subscribing to various newsletters. So let's say you come across a newsletter online and you find it interesting. So the natural next step is to subscribe to the newsletter. So the way you do that is by you enter your email and you hit submit, and that's it. And that's as far as you go. You have let the author know that you're interested in receiving their emails, but beyond that, you can't do much. You're just waiting until the author decides to publish a new version of their newsletter. And then you suddenly receive an email. And this system where you subscribe to the newsletter and then the author publishes the newsletter and then you receive it in your email, overall, technically is called a pub sub. Publish and subscribe. It's a publish and subscribe model where you will only receive the newsletter when the author publishes it. You're not going to receive it until they hit send the next time. So all you can do is subscribe and then wait. Same way, the apps can subscribe, not to newsletters, although maybe they can do that as well. But in this case, they subscribe to events, specific events that they're interested in other applications. So my to-do list application can subscribe to an event that is taking place in my email app. For example, when I label the email high priority, that is an event. It can say, I'm interested in knowing whenever that happens. It subscribes and then it waits until I go and label an email in my email app as high priority. At that time, my to-do list application finds out, oh, that event just took place. So this is called pub sub. So the app that is interested in knowing when a particular event is taking place just has to subscribe and wait until the event is published. So for example, in that case that I mentioned, until an email is labeled high priority, my to-do list application waits. It cannot do. It's subscribed. It has already showed the intent that I'm interested in knowing whenever this event takes place, do publish it and let me know because I'm a subscriber. So this is called pub sub. It's not necessary that only one app can subscribe to a given event in a given app. There could be multiple applications that subscribe to the same event. So it could be my to-do list application. It could be my Slack, a particular Slack channel that wants to get notified when a high priority email has been received. It could even be receiving a text message. My text message application can let my email application know that it's just interested in knowing whenever you have a high priority email. So there could be multiple things, multiple apps that can subscribe to the same event so that whenever that event takes place and the email application or that particular application publishes that event, they will get notified. And then whatever they need to do after that is just an action that we set up. Once they receive that notification that this event just took place, and then they use that as a trigger, and then the action could be different. So it could be sending a message, adding a to-do, adding it to the calendar, so on and so forth. So the point here is that these apps can subscribe to these events taking place in other applications. And then, of course, you can imagine that it's app to app. So many apps subscribe to many different apps, and it can become a whole web of communication happening between different applications. And this is happening all the time behind the scenes. We just don't look at it that way. So that is pub sub. And that's how apps communicate with each other. And yeah, just like I mentioned, all the triggers that we talked about are something that the apps can subscribe to. So they can subscribe to order being placed or a task being assigned or anything else. And whenever that event will take place, that particular app will publish the trigger, and anyone who has any app that has subscribed to that particular trigger will get notified, and then they will perform the action that they are being asked to do. So it could be, as we mentioned before, sending a text, add to sheet. So you can see these are connections that can be formed. Like whenever a task is assigned, send a text. Or whenever an order is placed, add it to a sheet. Or whenever a task is assigned, notify me. So you can form lines between any two. All I have to do is subscribe to those particular events in those particular apps, and then it's up to me what action I want to take, or it's up to the app what action it has been configured to do. So that's communication between the applications. But how do we do this? Like, I'm sure if you've checked the settings of your applications, there's no way to say, hey, let's go and subscribe to another application. There's no such thing. The apps don't have this built in natively, although some apps might have it, but it's not pretty common. So we need something in the middle for this to take place, this publish and subscribe, this pub sub to take place. We need like a middle player. We need someone in the middle to facilitate this subscription and communication. So what is that? We'll talk about that next. All right, it's time to reveal the last thing that we need for our automation to work. And as you remember, in the previous lesson, we stopped here and I mentioned that we need something here in the middle such that the whole pub sub model can be facilitated. So basically the apps here on the right should be able to subscribe to events to the apps here on the left. And then correspondingly, we should be able to configure what actions will take place when these triggers do happen. And that is where Zapier comes into the picture. So if we generalize it, we can say what we need in the middle is something like a rule book or a system to define the rules. And there are a lot of rules, meaning what we are subscribing to, what kind of actions to take place, what time these actions should take place, what should happen in these actions. So all these things are defined in a system or this rule book. And that is what Zapier allows us to do. And again, it's not just Zapier, it could be other automation tools as well. If you remember, I had mentioned the concepts are exactly the same. You have these 4 things: triggers, actions, communication between the apps, and a system to define the rules. But that system can be Zapier or can be other tools. It could be a business automation tool like Zapier or Make, or it could be an enterprise automation tool like Trade.io or Quixie, and so on and so forth. There's so many, but whatever you have access to, you can pretty much do the same things in all of them using the same concepts that we have been talking about. Of course, our focus is going to be on Zapier, but yeah, feel free to try other tools if you're curious. So continuing here, and just to close this lesson, what we have now is, we already mentioned that on the left is the triggers, on the right are the actions, and then in the middle is a system to define the rules and then facilitate the communication between the two. Because here we come in and we say, hey, we need to subscribe to X, Y, and Z event, but that communication also goes through one of these automation tools over to the other side. Because remember, I mentioned these apps don't necessarily have a way to communicate to the other apps directly. We need this middle player. So Zapier acts as both the person or the system facilitating the communication, as well as a place to define the rules. And then all in all, when we look at an automated workflow, especially in the case of Zapier, so in this case, when a task is assigned, send a text. So this whole thing, the whole trigger, the communication, the action, and what text to send, the whole thing, if we wrap it all together, this automated workflow in the Zapier world is called a Zap. And this is exactly going to be our focus in the next module, where we will be building our first Zap. We will take an example and then we will try to automate that in Zapier and basically building our first Zap. So Zap is nothing but an automated workflow in the Zapier world. So at this point, we have everything that we need. We understand what is workflow automation. We know how to identify when a workflow can be automated. And then finally, we know what happens behind the scenes. We have the triggers, the actions, there's communication happening, and there's a rule book and how Zapier has a role to play in all of this. And by the way, you can do all of this with code yourself if you know how to, or you can use a tool. And that's why it's called no-code workflow automation, because these tools are graphical in nature, visual in nature, and you don't necessarily have to write any code to make all this automation take place. So that's the beauty of it, that we get all the benefits without having to write any code or using any of the automation tools that I mentioned on the previous slide. So that's pretty much it. We'll stop here for this module. And when we come back in module 2, we will switch over to Zapier and make our way towards our first Zap. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to access the full course, you can look for the link in the description below or on my website, nocodeuniversity.net. I'll see you in the next one.